Welcome back as we continue these adventures in renewal together. In this video, we're going to talk about an easy way for the leaders and the members in your ministry to practice spiritual discernment. That's really just a sophisticated way to say, here's how we can take time to listen to God's word and ask, what might God be nudging us to consider at this time? Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says, "Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God." So let's talk about how we can begin together to be transformed and to discern what is the will of God by practicing how to listen to God in an intentional way. So before we do that, let's recap what we've learned so far. We've talked about how this work of renewal is not about finding an easy institutional fix or creating another program. It is about practicing a process that helps us ask good questions and to seek God's leading. That process, we've learned, has 4 basic steps. First, listen to God and to each other. Second, try little experiments to see what you learn. Number 3, reflect on what God is teaching you. And number 4, share stories of what you have tried and what you're learning so that others in your congregation can be transformed with you. So this work is based on 5 basic principles. Number 1, we believe God is active in the world, not just in the church or the church building. Second, we know that the church's renewal is tied up with joining God out in the world. Third, we believe God always begins with us where we are. So there's no shame and absolutely no blame in this work. Fourth, we know that we have much to learn. So we approach this process as disciples, as students eager to learn. And last, we know nothing is a failure and that God can and will teach us if we stay curious. Last, a foundational quote for us has been the wise words from Father Richard Rohr. We don't think our way into new behavior, we behave our way into new thinking. So in this video, we're going to begin that work of behaving our way into new thinking. And the tool that we will use is nothing particularly new. However, it is actually an ancient spiritual practice that has helped people of faith discern God's leading for many, many generations. In its current form, the practice is called dwelling in the Word. In this video, we are going to explain why this approach is important, how you can go about it, and how we can continue shifting our language in order to shift the culture of our congregations.
Dwelling in the Word is a simple process in which you read a particular passage twice, leaving some silence between the readings, and then hold space for reflection around a couple of open-ended questions. You invite people to pair up and share their reflections around those questions with each other. And then, here's the key. You invite people to share back with the large group, not what their own answers were, but what their partners' answers were. In that way, this practice helps us listen to God and to each other at the same time. Those open-ended reflection questions are, first, what did you notice? Second, what questions come up for you as you hear this? And third, what might God be nudging us to consider through this passage? This practice of dwelling in the Word is something we are going to invite you to begin within your team first. Later, you can use it as the first listening experiment your team helps lead in the congregation. It's a listening experiment and can be rich for learning because it is so different from the way many of us have done Bible study in the church. In a more traditional Bible study, church members may be hesitant to share their own thoughts about a passage out of fear they will get it wrong. Sometimes folks look to the pastor to provide, quote unquote, the right answer. This goes back to what we had named in a previous video, that for the last couple of generations, we have been acting as though God's activity is mostly in the church, not out in everyday life. And then by extension, we end up believing that God mostly speaks through the church professionals and not the members. But if an important part of our renewal work is reclaiming the ministry of all the baptized people of God, then we have to begin by reclaiming the practice of group spiritual discernment. And you do not have to be ordained to work with other Christians to discern God's leading for the church. That last point is pretty important, so let me say it again. You do not have to be ordained to work with other Christians to discern God's leading for the church. Put simply, this practice of dwelling in the Word can help us learn again how to discern God's will together.
It's important to note that this practice is about dwelling in the Word. It's not a quick skimming of God's Word, but rather lingering in the Word, soaking in it. Our assumption is that the Scriptures are rich with meaning for our lives. And if that's true, then they're rich with meaning for the future of our church as well. Now, while this practice of dwelling in the Word can be done with any biblical text, there are some stories that are particularly rich for the kind of church renewal work we're engaged in. So we're going to suggest that you begin by dwelling in the book of Acts, chapter 16, verses 6 through 15. Now, this is the story of the early apostles on a journey. They continually seek God's leading, and the winding path they end up taking turns out to be both unexpected and exactly what they needed. The story ends with them finding their way to Lydia, a wealthy and influential woman who biblical scholars tell us would go on to essentially become the founder of the Philippian church. It's a great story that shows how the process of discerning God's leading is often a winding path, but that God leads us to the places we need to go and to the people we need to meet. Now, here's the key. We're going to suggest that your team and your congregation spend a good 9 to 12 months in this one passage, returning to it over and over and over again. Now, at first, this may seem crazy, because we're used to studying the Bible like it's a college textbook. Once you find the right answer from a part of it, you move on to the next part. We've read that part. We get what it means. Now let's just move on. But if Scripture is the living Word of God, then it can speak anew to us every day. And this story from Acts 16 has so much to teach us about following God's lead. So we're going to ask you to trust this process and to make a firm commitment to the experiment of listening to and dwelling in this one story for a good long time. Now you might be wondering, why is this important? Well, first, we're building the capacity to see new things in the familiar, which is key to this renewal process. Remember, we're behaving our way into new thinking, and staying in the same passage for a while teaches us to look for God's activity, even in things that are very familiar. At first, you might think you'll run out of things to say if you spend too long in the same passage. But I can tell you, as someone who has read this Acts 16 passage many, many times, every single time I hear it, God leads me to what I need to hear that day. Second, this is important because it helps us learn that God speaks to all of us, not just to whoever we think is the expert in the room. It helps us get away from thinking biblical passages have one correct meaning. Really, what we are doing is exercising our muscles for spiritual discernment of the congregation's future, rather than looking to the expert, aka the pastor, to fix it all. As we said before, sometimes church members are nervous to offer their thoughts in Bible study because they might think they're going to get it wrong. But by giving everyone permission to name what they are hearing in a passage, we're beginning to lift them up and show them that they too are leaders within the church. So it might not seem like it at first, but this simple practice is an important first step to strengthening the lay leadership in our congregation. And last, this practice of dwelling in the Word actually helps us practice listening both to God and to one another. Often when in conversation with someone else, we aren't really paying deep attention to what they're saying. We're interested in what we could say next. And then as soon as they stop talking for a second, we jump in with what we think. But this process of dwelling in the Word with a group invites us to slow down and intentionally listen to someone else. And that skill will become really important as we begin to listen to those outside of our congregation as well.
So here's how we're going to invite you to practice this. We'll explain the process in this video, but you can also refer to the Dwelling in the Word description and passage that is found in the same place that you found this video. First, make sure everyone has a copy of the page that has Acts 16 on it and the questions at the bottom. And make sure everyone has a pen or a pencil so they can underline, circle, or make any notes. Next, explain to the group how this is going to go so they aren't surprised later. Tell them you're going to have two different voices read the passage with some silence between. And then, after it has been read twice, you are going to invite them to find one person in the room who they would like to get to know better. Sometimes we jokingly say, find a reasonably friendly-looking stranger. That's helpful for when you are doing this in a large group. But the point is to help people connect with someone they aren't already close with. Then, once you've explained the process, take a couple of deep breaths together and have someone in the room offer a brief prayer that God would speak to each one of us through this time. This helps the group become more centered and open to God's leading. Next, have one person read the passage. Leave a few moments of silence for people to reflect on the questions at the bottom and write any notes. Then have a second person read the passage. Again, a few more moments of silence for individual reflection. After the passage has been read twice, invite people to find someone in the room they don't know as well, and tell them you're going to give them 4 to 5 minutes each to share with each other their own answers to the questions at the bottom of the page. But remind them what they will be invited to share back with the large group at the end is not their own thoughts, but what they heard from their partner. Give them permission to take notes if they are worried about forgetting. Make sure someone calls out in the room when 4 or 5 minutes has gone by, inviting folks to switch who is sharing if they haven't done so already. Consider setting a timer on someone's phone so you can announce to the whole group that it is time to switch and let the other partner share.
Then, after each partner has had the chance to share for 4 to 5 minutes, invite everyone's attention back to the large group and hold a discussion in which folks introduce their partner and share some of their partner's reflections. Make sure someone is taking notes, maybe on a whiteboard or a big sticky note, so the group can refer back to that wisdom later. Every single time we have led this exercise, it is this discussion that yields beautiful statements about how the people in the book of Acts followed God's lead and how we might do the same. So you'll definitely want to capture, in a way everyone can see, the wisdom that emerges from this group discussion. If you are doing this with a small group like your team, then every single pair of people can share back with the large group. Later on, as you do this in larger and larger groups in the congregation, responses from every single person in the room may not be possible. Just make sure you hold space for a good handful of answers to each of the 3 questions. Now, there are two important things we have noticed in leading this exercise with many different groups. First, when folks name the questions that are coming to their minds, groups often try to begin answering those questions right then and there. We would encourage you to have the group simply name the questions rather than try to answer them. It's so easy to get into fix-it mode right away and try to tie things up with a bow. But the real truth is that in this kind of spiritual discernment and renewal work, often good, rich questions are the better gift. Here's an example. In many discussions on Acts 16, we have heard people offer some version of this question: who are the Lydias in our lives? This is an example of a time when the question itself is the gift. Trying to answer this too quickly would probably shut down the chance for deep wisdom from the group. Continuing to offer this question back to the group over a number of months, however, could really open up great discussions at every point. The second thing we have noticed in leading this dwelling in the Word exercise is how important the wording of that third question is. What might God be nudging us to consider? We don't have to speak definitively for God. By using the word might, this question allows for people to guess and gives them permission to simply share whatever is stirring in their hearts. So definitely make sure to keep that word might in there. So that's the process of leading dwelling in the Word. Regular use of this simple practice can begin to shift the culture of spiritual discernment in your congregation. For your field work following this video, we suggest you begin using dwelling in the Word, specifically dwelling in the Acts 16 text, to begin each of your team's meetings. Give it time and take notes on the wisdom shared. This is a particularly rich text for the work of church renewal. After you do that as a team a time or two, begin thinking about ways to invite larger and larger groups of people in your congregation into it. Maybe your team will attend a council meeting and invite them to do it with you. Maybe your group can offer this dwelling in the Word practice some Sunday instead of the normally scheduled Bible study. Maybe you'll take one Sunday morning and lead the whole congregation in this practice instead of having a sermon that day. In fact, it's likely that you'll find all sorts of other creative ways to invite more and more people in your congregation into this beautiful practice. As we named, it is a simple and important first step to building up the lay leadership in your congregation. It also helps begin to shift the focus from church questions to God questions.
This is the last thing that we want to mention as we close out this video. In previous videos, we had named briefly how important it is to begin shifting the culture of the congregation by shifting the way we speak. One simple and very important way to do this is to make an intentional effort to ask more God questions than we do church questions. Take a look at the sheet entitled Asking God Questions, also found wherever you access this video. This page contains some examples of God questions that we can ask. Here are a few things to notice. First, notice the word might here as well. Just like with the dwelling in the Word practice, this word is really important here because it gives us permission to guess, permission to not know everything, but still do something. We are so used to seeking certainty and absolutes, but the truth is, the quest for certainty kills curiosity. That's another one of those simple but profound statements. The quest for certainty kills curiosity. Genuine curiosity is vital in the work of church renewal. In the early church, there was a lot of curiosity. They ask questions like, where is God leading us? And who else might be a Lydia for us? They asked, where is God active in the world? And how might we join in? These are curiosity questions. They don't lead us to certainty. They lead us on an adventure for which we do not know the end. So, we encourage you to keep an eye out for this dynamic in yourself and in the broader congregation. Listen for where there is a push for certainty, for definite answers. Your coach can help you listen for this as well. Practice asking and dwelling in God questions like the ones on this page, instead of seeking definite answers right away. If you have a pastor, this can also be an important part of their role with your renewal team as well, helping the group name and practice asking God questions. The second thing to notice about the questions on this page is just how different they are from questions like, how do we get more young people? Or how do we find more resources? Those are understandable questions, but they are institutional questions, not spiritual ones. Our call in this process is to spiritual renewal first, before any institutional renewal can actually take root. This is, we've experienced, really, really key. The problem with many of the questions we're used to asking is that they tend to put us in the driver's seat. What should we do? How can we fix this? In those questions, the church is the primary agent. And let's be honest, many of us are tired from feeling like it's our job to, quote, fix the church. Remember from a previous video, we talked about how the invitation in this work is to shift from a focus on fixing the church to a focus on following the Spirit. Shifting our language from church questions to God questions is one way to begin practicing this focus on following the Spirit. That brings us to the final topic of this video, which is an invitation to complete field work, kind of like homework, but out in the field. And we're inviting you to do that before moving on to the next video. Your field work for this segment is to look over the questions on this page, talk with the group about what you're noticing in them, and then try writing a couple of your own. We encourage you to begin practicing reframing questions from church questions to God questions. One way to do this is to take a couple of questions you hear others in your congregation asking and practice reframing those. Take some time to brainstorm a handful of church questions that you are pretty used to hearing people around you in the congregation ask. A common example might be, how do we get more young people? But there are others. Make a list of what you hear others asking or church questions that you have. Then, as a group, practice together rewriting these questions. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just practice. Practice moving toward curiosity over certainty. Feel free to look back at the notes you took during your dwelling in the Word times as well. Those reflections are often a really good primer for asking what God is up to.
As we end this video, we want to circle back to a deep truth at the heart of all of this. The work of church renewal must begin with spiritual revitalization, not institutional quick fixes. One of the folks who has been doing this work a long time said to us, if our only focus is on how to make the church grow, we are probably going to be bad at it. But if our focus is on how to follow God's leading as we listen to and love our neighbors, then both spiritual and institutional renewal are possible. We know this is true with every fiber of our being. And this is an adventure. Just like in Acts 16, we don't know where God is going to lead us, but we are trying to practice actively seeking the Spirit's lead, putting God in the driver's seat. And with that focus, God will teach us what we need to learn. Remember, we're disciples, and disciples are students, eager to learn. We're going to close this video with a blessing from Psalm 136. Now, there's a refrain that's repeated 26 times in that one psalm alone. God's steadfast love endures forever. The psalm lists the mighty deeds of God throughout time and then repeats over and over and over, God's steadfast love endures forever. May that be a blessing for you as you continue these adventures in renewal. Yes, things are changing, as they always have. God's steadfast love endures forever. Yes, it's an interesting time to be the church for sure, but God's steadfast love endures forever. And that's as true now as it has always been, and that is the foundation for doing this work.
Here are your summary notes from this video. First, the only path forward is one of spiritual revitalization, not institutional quick fixes. Remember, if our only focus is on how to get the church to grow, we'll probably be bad at it. But if our focus is on how to follow God's leading as we listen to and love our neighbors, then both spiritual and institutional renewal are possible. Second, we introduce an ancient spiritual practice called dwelling in the Word, which can help us practice intentionally listening to both God and to one another. And we're going to use that practice as a team and in a larger congregation. Third, we named that the quest for certainty kills curiosity. Together, we're going to watch for this drive for certainty in ourselves and others. As one way to practice leaning into curiosity over certainty, we named how important it is to shift our language from church questions to God questions. And we offered a few simple ways to practice this. Our goal is to practice seeking the Spirit's leading instead of rushing to quick fix, definite answers. Now, here's your field work. First, use the practice of dwelling in the Word with your team. If you've never used the Acts 16 passage for an extended period of time, we strongly encourage you to start with that. If you have already spent a significant amount of time in Acts 16, either in this process or in a previous one, you could continue by using the stories in Luke 10, verses 1 to 11, which is the story of the sending of the 70. Second, after your team has practiced dwelling in the Word a couple of times, begin planning for a couple of simple ways for the team to lead the practice with other groups in the congregation, like the council or other ministry teams, maybe Bible study groups, or even Sunday morning worship. Third, spend some time as a team reflecting on the Asking God Questions sheet. Make sure to take time to list the church questions you hear people asking or have asked yourself. Then practice turning them into God questions instead. Consider sharing this practice with your church council as well. As always, look at the notes you're taking from your Dwelling in the Word discussions to find some ideas.